So we have shared before and through board meetings and town halls, I believe, about the blended learning model and what that would look like. So we really wanted to take some time and go a little bit deeper into a virtual model, since we will be starting all students in a distance format. So we wanted to start really by just reminding you about the great education we do provide in Los Altos School District, regardless of what form of instruction, teaching, and learning that we're working in. And we really define that great education through our strong relationships, through our great instruction and purposeful work for kids, through our ability to personalize learning for students, and kind of the most, not the most, but a critical piece there is this opportunities to really make meaning together, to make learning come alive for students. Next slide. So a couple of those pieces were missing in emergency remote teaching. So I'm really hoping tonight to be able to show you how we are bringing all of those pieces back, and really that regardless of which end of the continuum we begin in and transition to throughout the course of the year, or whether you choose to opt into the virtual model for the entire year or a portion of the year, your child will really be receiving a comprehensive learning experience. Next slide. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about virtual learning. One more, next slide. Oh, thank you. So just as a reminder, we know we have these two forms. We have asynchronous learning, which is independent, right? It can be done anywhere, anytime, digitally, non-digitally. And we have our synchronous, which is really that real-time live. Next little blurb there. So if we focus on the asynchronous, we've talked about learning plans before. This will really be kind of that foundation of the independent learning that happens. Those learning plans include the rich instructional videos, whether that is from their classroom teacher or an expert teacher in LASD, or one of our partner expert teachers through Teachers College for our English curriculum. And along with that rich instruction is the meaningful work that is assigned through learning plans, the tasks. We heard loud and clear from families in the spring that the screen time was a challenge. So we are being particularly mindful of ensuring that there is a balance of screen time and offline work that students can do, whether that is some notebooks that go home, some worksheets that might go home, some projects that go home, books that we're able to circulate following the social or the health and safety guidelines. And we know that asynchronous, one of the greatest pieces of asynchronous learning is this idea of students having some agency, some choice in when they do something and where they start and how they want to move along and what their own pacing looks like. Another click, let's look at synchronous. So synchronous in our virtual world is really going to happen through Google Meet. And it's really an opportunity for our teachers to do those things that are a challenge to do independently. So it's having the conversation. It is supporting students in the work that they are doing and building upon that work. We also heard loud and clear from our both our teachers and our students and parents that we want to have more opportunity to have live required interaction with teachers. So there will be options or opportunities, not options, required whole class, half class, small group Google Meets throughout the school day. So that should look very different, and I'll show you what that might look like in just a moment. Next slide. So we've talked about this before, but students will access their learning asynchronously through the learning plan. Each subject area will have its own learning plan. It will be pushed out to parents and to students through Google Classroom. Next slide. You might remember this from a previous slide deck in the past about learning plans, but this idea that through the learning plan, we're also trying to communicate to our parents or caregivers who might be supporting our less independent learners with just some reminders about following routines, that there will be a weekly calendar or a weekly schedule for students to be able to follow, and how parents can help support that as well. Next slide. And so while the learning plan is really the focus of that independent learning time and the foundation of what's happening, on the left there you see students will have a weekly lesson schedule. So while there is some choice and some self-pacing choice, we do want to make sure that there's a clear expectation in whatever grade and whatever class that this week I would like you to complete lessons 12 through 15. Or whatever that might be. So it's really clear for students what those expectations are in each of their subject areas, including due dates and when the work will be giving some feedback to students as well. And then on the right there, so in addition to the lesson schedule, kind of that independent work, there will be a schedule for students for what their weekly Google Meet schedule looks like. And again, well, we'll talk about more of that in a minute. Next slide. So this was really just highlighting this idea of those comprehensive learning plans. Students are working independently on the bottom there, using those learning plans, and then that synchronous time through Google Meets is really where the magic happens. That's when our assessments will be happening. That's when we'll be building relationships and building that social and emotional wellness. That's when we have the conversations and really understand what students are able to understand from their independent learning and build upon it. So that is how that will be working. Next slide. And so when we think about a Google Meet, I'm sure all of you had varying experiences as we were thrust into emergency remote teaching, but we really want to be a little bit more systematic and thoughtful for what that Google Meet experience looks like. While we may still have some kind of optional office hours, there will be required Google Meets for each subject over the course of the day and or week. So we want you and we want teachers to think about, if you think about an hour of time or 50 minutes in our junior high, that we really want to start with the whole class for a period of time. This is a great time for teacher to kind of review what students have been learning independently or re-engage them in some way. It could be the teacher providing a demonstration to the whole class or some modeling of the type of work that they expect students to be doing. They might be front loading the next kind of round of independent work. So there's some time in that whole class. And then the teacher on any given day is going to say, okay, half of your class, my group B, off you go into your independent learning plan. And I'm going to keep the other half of the class with me and get a little bit deeper and start having those conversations about, tell me what you've learned, show me your work. I'd really like to see this. What questions did we have? I can do a little more formal assessment in this small group. And finally, I've whittled that down and now I say, okay, you students, go off and do your next round of independent learning. And I have my small group of students. This could be my English learners. It could be students who need a little extension because clearly they're catching on very quickly. It could be students who just need a little bit of reteaching because I could see in my half class time that they weren't quite where I wanted them to be. So we really want to see that Google Meet a little bit more systematic or much more systematic than it was in the springtime. Next slide. So what are all the different things that might happen during a Google Meet? They may focus, we've talked a lot about, and each of our teachers completed a professional development or 5 modules, but the last module was about building relationships and digital learning. So a great thing is to start each and every Google Meet with a little connector, something fun. I know our young kids were out doing scavenger hunts throughout their classroom, but we can do something that of course is age appropriate. But you can see here all of the many things that will happen over the course of a Google Meet, sometimes in that whole group, sometimes in that half group, sometimes in my small group. Next slide. And so I don't want to forget our specials. We talked a lot about springtime really being focused on required core content classes, and the specials or the electives felt a little bit optional. All of our specials are coming back, so students will have required PE, access to great electives at our junior high schools. All of our great programs will be alive. They too will be using learning plans and a combination of that asynchronous and synchronous learning with live meets as well. Next slide. Jennifer, we're gonna pass it on to you for a couple of special education details, and then we'll come back.
All right, thank you, Sandra. So we will, and we have been communicating with our parents for students who have IEPs, and we will continue to update them as changes occur. We have been working really hard to try to bring students who struggled the most with distance learning back onto campus with these new guidelines that we are preparing for virtual, but we're still at the same time looking to see what we can do to try to start to bring some students back. Again, I know that our superintendent talked a little bit about a waiver. We're still exploring possibilities, but we hear you, and we know that some students really need individual teaching or on-campus teaching, and we're working really hard around that. But until we can get through that process, we are going to be planning for virtual start of the school year. You will all receive an updated distance learning plan, and our pledge is to try to fulfill our IEP minutes as much as possible. At our elementary sites, our resource specialist programs will be supporting students, accessing, making sure that the accommodations are in place, helping them, making sure they understand what's happening, and then also with the work. And then also they'll be having separate sessions to work on their IEP goals outside of the Google Meets that Sandra is talking about. And instructional assistants will be supporting as they would in a brick and mortar time. Same with special day classes. They'll be supporting students accessing their gen ed curriculums per their IEPs. And then they'll also have their own Google Classroom for direct teaching of content areas. And instructional assistants will also be supporting students both in the gen ed classroom through their Google Meets, individually as needed for the content, and then also in the special day class settings. Next slide. For special education services, we are looking at limiting the amount of adult contact. So we are starting all of our services remotely, and we will be working individually with families whose students have a really difficult time doing that. But in general, even when we are able to come back, we're going to be maintaining a lot of our services remotely to minimize the adult contact and bringing in more students into the more kind of germs into those cohorts. So our speech therapy, occupational therapy, vision, deaf and hard of hearing, all of those will be delivered remotely. Our behavior services will start out remotely and then hopefully transition to in-person when we can start to bring students back. Our counseling services will continue with teletherapy. And again, I will just say that if you are a parent of a student with an IEP, you'll be hearing more from me in the coming weeks. Okay, back to you.
Thank you. Next slide. Thanks, Marcy. So to give a little bit more detail to what a schedule or what a student week may look like for our K-6 students, we would expect that over the course of the week that students are engaging in 5 lessons over the course of the week in those core content areas of reading, writing, and math. They would have 2 science or social studies lessons throughout that week. That could also be STEM if we're in our STEM project mode during that time. And then in addition to that, there will be some asynchronous time for those special courses where they might be working on a project in music or a living classroom or what have you. So that's kind of over the course of the week. But then when we think about that synchronous time, each morning there will be a morning meeting for our elementary students with their classroom teacher. And then Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, there will be a series of Google Meets for each of their subject areas. And then we really want to close each day in our elementary with a class closing circle. It's a nice way to wrap up a virtual learning day so that everybody gets a little positive ending to their school day. Next slide. And so what might an actual student day look like? Again, these are not exact times. This is a sample schedule, but we would expect, and if you notice the color coding, we would expect students to begin with their morning meeting. And then right from there, go into their reading workshop, Google Meet with their teacher. Again, if we think of that triangle, we'll spend some time as our whole group, and then individual kids might spend a longer period of time, or they might go right out into doing their independent learning plan work for reading. We want to make sure that kids have built-in breaks. I know your teachers will be working with you on setting up family routines and schedules, but there will be time for math, for social studies or science, or perhaps we're in our STEM project during that time. After lunch, we might get back into our writing and have some PE. For our sixth graders, we would expect that they would have social studies and science, so keep that in mind. So there's a nice mix and time of that synchronous and asynchronous, especially at the beginning of the year for our youngest learners. Those times are going to be shortened. We know that they don't have a great attention span to be able to engage with a computer for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, nor can they independently learn for any amounts of time. So those times would be whittled down a bit. But hopefully you see that there is much more synchronous time with their teacher throughout the school day than many of you might have experienced in the spring. Next slide. Wednesdays, you may remember that Wednesdays we will be starting with a morning meeting. Our specials will be available to students through a schedule on Wednesdays. It is the day where there will be the most independent learning time because we believe it's really critical for our teachers to have planning time and collaboration time to be able to work together and provide that good feedback that we are bringing back to the school. But even so, your child will have access to their special teachers as well as their classroom teacher every morning. Next slide. That was elementary and junior high. A little bit similar, so we would expect 5 lessons in the core classes over the course of the week and several lessons of PE and or electives throughout the course of that week. We are beginning our mornings with an advisory meeting, which is really the social and emotional relationship building. Welcome to junior high. You are an adolescent and we're living in the middle of a global pandemic. Type of meeting that will occur in the mornings. And then again, our students will have access to their teachers for required Google Meets following that same upside down triangle for each of their subject areas. Next slide. And just an example of what a junior high schedule might look like. Period 1, period 2, period 3, period 4 are those 4 core classes: English, science, math, and history. And then PE elective, depending on the number of electives that a student selects, their afternoon might look a little bit different. Again, these are not exact times. Next slide. And the Wednesday as well, a little bit more independent learning time, but still plenty of time with a live teacher. Next slide. And just really, I hope you see that our virtual version of school will be much more comprehensive. You know, we didn't talk about the other things we have before around bringing back mastery grading and high quality feedback for students, really assessing students. But we are looking forward to starting the year in this virtual mode because it is what we have to do, and we plan to be able to deliver a really terrific program for our students and for our families, and to be flexible as the situation changes.